The camera stops, but something else begins. The sun was barely up when Sydney Sweeney arrived on set. It was her second week filming the biggest role of her life, a sweeping historical drama directed by a man known more for his ego than his storytelling. Still, she had walked into this project with high hopes. People said this would be the film that would finally win awards. It had big names, an even bigger budget, and Keanu Reeves. She had been excited to meet him, not because of the fame, but because of the stories. Stories of kindness, patience, and quiet brilliance. She needed someone like that now. Even if she didn't know it yet, the set buzzed with tension before the cameras rolled. Crew members whispered while adjusting lights. Makeup artists worked quickly, almost nervously. Sydney sat in silence at the edge of the soundstage, dressed in her costume, a velvet gown that scratched her skin and made her feel like someone else. She liked becoming someone else. But today, she wasn't ready. Then he arrived, the director. He was tall, sharp-featured, and always held his coffee like it was more important than the people around him. He didn't smile. He didn't look anyone in the eye unless they were famous. And when he spoke, his words felt like tiny knives, polished, precise, but meant to cut. "Why is she still in makeup?" he snapped, even though Sydney was clearly ready. Someone mumbled something about lighting adjustments. The director rolled his eyes and kept walking. "I don't have time to wait for people who don't understand pace," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Sydney stood up, slowly, her fingers curling into fists. She wanted to say something, but she'd been taught to be professional, to not make waves. Hollywood liked the quiet ones, until it didn't. Keanu Reeves wasn't on set yet. She looked toward the side doors, hoping he'd appear, but the hallway was empty. The scene started with her running through a burning field, sobbing, calling out for someone who would never return. It was emotional, raw. She had rehearsed it 100 times. But today, she felt off. They ran it 3 times. On the 4th take, she stumbled slightly. Her shoe caught on the edge of the set, and she didn't fall, but her balance wavered. She caught herself, kept going. She didn't break character. She poured everything into the next line. When they called cut, silence filled the room. Then came the voice. "Cut, cut, cut," the director barked. "This is what we're doing now? We're tripping through our performance?" His words hung in the air. Sydney froze. "You want to win awards, Sweeney? You think people cry for you because you look sad on camera? This isn't TikTok. This is cinema. Maybe try acting like you belong here." Her chest tightened. A few crew members looked away. Some lowered their eyes. No one said a word, not even the assistant director who had praised Sydney's performance only yesterday. She didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, she walked off set slowly, like the air had gotten heavier, like she was underwater. Behind her, the director sighed loudly and ordered a break. The crew scattered. Laughter returned, fake, awkward, trying to cover up what everyone just witnessed, and then the door opened. Keanu Reeves walked in. He wore a soft gray hoodie, jeans, and the kind of calm expression that seemed to absorb chaos instead of react to it. People greeted him, but he didn't return smiles out of habit. He looked around slowly, read the room. Something wasn't right. He found Sydney sitting by the equipment cases, staring at the floor. "Hey," he said gently, crouching beside her. "You okay?" She didn't answer at first, but then her voice came, low and steady. "He humiliated me in front of everyone," she whispered. "Over a stumble. Like I was nothing." Keanu's face didn't change, but his eyes darkened, like clouds forming behind calm skies. "Do you want to leave?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, I want to finish this. I don't know how to stand in front of the camera when someone's trying to tear me." "Down behind it." Keanu nodded once. He stood up and walked directly onto the set. The director was adjusting a light fixture, yelling at a crew member for something minor when Keanu approached him. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. "Can we talk for a second?" Keanu said quietly. The director blinked, surprised. "We're in the middle of—" "Just a second." Something in his voice made the director follow. They stepped into a quiet corner behind the set wall. No one could hear their conversation. Not exactly. But eyes watched, ears strained. And as the two spoke, the crew noticed something shift. The director's confident posture faltered. His eyes darted, his arms crossed, then dropped. Keanu stood still the entire time, speaking softly, slowly, with purpose. When they returned, the director didn't speak. Instead, he called everyone to reset the shot. But this time, before the cameras rolled, Keanu walked onto the stage and stood beside Sydney. "You ready?" he asked her with a kind smile. She hesitated, then nodded. "Good," he said, "because the world needs to see what you can do." And as she walked to her mark, something in the room had changed. The air was no longer heavy. The whispers had stopped. The crew stood straighter. Even the assistant director offered her a small nod. But just as they were about to start, the director called out again, not to berate her, but to announce something that sent a shock through the entire soundstage. "New direction. Keanu, you're in this scene now." Everyone froze. Keanu turned, surprised. "What?" he said. The director cleared his throat. "We're rewriting it. It makes more sense if your character finds her. Gives the scene more power, more connection. It's what the film needs." But Sydney could see it wasn't about the script. This was a test, a public test, and Keanu knew it too. He looked at the director, then back at Sydney, then he nodded. "Let's give them something to remember," he said softly. And as the cameras rolled again, with Keanu by her side, Sydney ran across the field. This time, she didn't stumble. Her tears were real. Her pain was real. And when she fell into his arms, broken and breathless, the silence on set wasn't from disapproval. It was from awe. But just as the director began clapping, thinking he had regained control of the moment, a quiet voice from the production trailer radioed in. Words that would change everything before part 2 even began. We have a problem. Legal's on the line. It's about the contract. Something big. It concerns Keanu's clause." Keanu heard it. So did the director. And the look that passed between them was not about film anymore. It was about truth, and what had just been awakened. The clause Keanu never spoke of. The silence after the call was heavy. Even the hum of the cameras seemed to fade. The director turned slowly, his face pale, as if he had just seen the future crack in half. Keanu didn't move. He stood in the same calm posture, one hand gently resting at his side, the other brushing dust from his sleeve. No panic, no confusion, just silence, like he was waiting for something he already knew would come. Sydney glanced between them, heart still pounding. From the last take, she had felt something shift in that moment, something real, something powerful. The connection between her and Keanu on screen had been raw, almost too raw. But now that energy had turned cold, as if someone had opened a hidden door and let a storm in. A production assistant ran over, holding a tablet with shaking hands. He whispered something to the director. The director's lips tightened. Then he snatched the device, scrolled quickly, eyes scanning lines of text no one else could see. When he looked up, the color in his face was gone completely. "This isn't possible," he muttered. This can't be real." Keanu walked over slowly and took the tablet from his hand, eyes skimming the screen. When he finished reading, he handed it back without saying a word. The director stared at him, almost in disbelief. "You knew about this? This clause?" Keanu nodded, just once. Sydney stepped closer. "What clause?" The director didn't answer. "So, Keanu did, 3 years ago," he said quietly. "I agreed to work on this film, But I made a request. Just one. Sydney listened carefully. So did everyone else. I said I'd only sign on if there was a clause added to the contract, he continued. A human clause, one line, buried deep in the legal pages where no one would care to look. It states that if anyone on set, regardless of role, is publicly humiliated, belittled, or disrespected by leadership without cause, the production pauses. Instantly. Until a full investigation is completed by a neutral third party. Someone gasped. That's not enforceable, the director snapped, but his voice cracked slightly. Keanu tilted his head. It was reviewed by 3 firms. And you signed it. Because back then, you needed a name attached to the film. You needed my name. The director opened his mouth, but said nothing. Keanu looked at the assistant director. I want a full record of today's events. All footage, all audio, all crew testimonies. We don't need to go that far, the director interrupted, trying to regain control. It was a misunderstanding. Actors stumble. Tensions run high. Keanu turned slowly. You didn't critique her performance. You mocked her. You humiliated her. That's not directing. That's ego. The air tightened. Sydney felt tears build behind her eyes. Not from pain, but from something else. The shock of being defended in a world where silence was the norm. She had never seen someone pull back the curtain like that. Not for her. Not for anyone. And then came the twist. From behind the lighting rig, a woman stepped forward, mid-40s, sharp eyes, headset still hanging around her neck. She had been quiet most of the shoot. No one really noticed her. Just another face in the crowd. But now, as she walked into the light, she carried something in her hands. A flash drive. This has the rehearsal feed, she said calmly. It captured the director's words, tone, everything. It's backed up off-site too, for security. The director stared at her in disbelief. Why would you do that? She didn't flinch. Because I've been on 27 sets, and this is the first time I've seen someone actually stand up when it matters. She handed the drive to Keanu. He didn't smile. He just nodded. But then came something no one expected. The director, suddenly desperate, turned to Sydney. Look, I didn't mean anything personal. I was pushing you. That's what great directors do. They push people to be better. Sydney stepped forward slowly. Her voice didn't rise, but it was firm, unshaking. You weren't pushing me. You were trying to break me. The words hit like thunder. Keanu placed a hand on her shoulder just for a moment. A quiet gesture, but powerful, and as he did, the crew around them started to move. Not away from Sydney, but toward her. Standing near, standing tall, not saying much, but saying enough, just by being there. The director, once so sure of his place, now stood alone in the middle of the set he once ruled. Then the studio called. A producer's voice rang out over the speakerphone, tight with anger and urgency. Halt. Production immediately. Legal is stepping in. We'll be flying out 2 compliance officers tonight. No more shooting until further notice. Keanu, we'd like to speak with you privately within the hour. The call ended. Everyone stared at Keanu. He looked around the room, then spoke softly. If we want to make something truly great, we need to start by treating each other like people. Not props. He turned to Sydney. You were powerful today. Don't let anyone take that from you. She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. But just as she thought it was over, that the day couldn't possibly hold more surprises, the woman with the headset stepped closer again. There's something else you should see. She said to Keanu. He raised an eyebrow. What is it? Sydney asked. The woman hesitated, then looked directly at her. It's not just you, she said. This director has a pattern. I have footage, notes, testimonies from previous sets. Most people were too afraid to come forward. Keanu's expression hardened. Bring everything, the woman nodded. And as the sun began to set outside, painting gold across the windows of the silent soundstage, Sydney realized this wasn't just about her anymore. This was bigger, and someone had finally lit a match in a room soaked in silence. The silence before the storm, the next morning arrived with a strange calm, like the set itself was holding its breath. The studio lot, usually bustling by 7, sat quieter than anyone could remember. Trailers were locked, lights untouched, breakfast tables untouched. The director's car was gone. And yet, inside one trailer, the air was heavy with decisions that could not be reversed. Keanu sat alone in front of a small table, a cup of green tea growing cold beside him. Across from him lay the flash drive, the one handed to him the day before, still in its plastic case. He hadn't opened it yet, not because he didn't believe what was on it, but because he already knew what it meant. It wasn't just about a clause or a contract anymore. It was about something every actor, crew member, and assistant had known for years but had dared not speak aloud. Power was rarely challenged, and when it was, the cost was high. A soft knock interrupted the stillness. Sydney stepped in slowly, wearing no makeup, her hair pulled back in a simple knot. Her eyes looked clearer, less afraid than yesterday, but still searching for something. Maybe direction, maybe courage, maybe both. "They're here," she said quietly. Keanu nodded. He stood, picked up the flash drive, and followed her outside. On the far side of the lot, 2 black sedans were parked near the executive trailer. A man and woman stepped out dressed in gray, briefcases in hand. They didn't smile, didn't offer greetings, just asked where they could find a private place to speak. They were from compliance, the kind of people who only appeared when the studios were scared. And today, they were very scared. Inside the meeting room, Keanu handed them the flash drive. Sydney watched from the corner, silent, heart thudding. The woman from compliance plugged it in, clicked a file. Footage began to play, shaky but clear enough. The director's voice filled the room, his tone sharp, his insults unmistakable. Each word felt worse than the last. And then came Sydney's face, holding back tears, trying to stay in character even as the weight of humiliation pressed down. When the clip ended, the man from compliance leaned back, arms folded. "This alone justifies disciplinary action," he said flatly. The woman added, "But you mentioned there's more?" Keanu nodded. "Someone else has testimony, and files from his past shoots. A pattern of behavior. Can we meet them?" The man asked. Keanu motioned to the door. The woman with the headset entered. Her name was Claire. She didn't carry a briefcase or wear a suit, but she carried something stronger. The truth. She laid out her materials on the table. Emails. Reports. Old call sheets with strange notations. Even text messages from frightened crew members too scared to speak up. The compliance officers studied everything in silence. When they were done, the woman looked up at Claire. "Why didn't you come forward before?" Claire shrugged. No one would have listened. "Not without someone like him," she said, nodding toward Keanu. He didn't react. He didn't need to. Outside, the crew gathered slowly, unsure if they were allowed back on set. Word had spread fast. Some still didn't believe it. Others said it was about time. But everyone felt the same thing. Something was changing. Something big. Sydney sat on a metal crate near the lighting rig, staring up at the rafters. One of the grips walked by, paused, then handed her a bottle of water. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "You were great," he added, almost shyly. "That scene. I've never seen anything like it." "Thank you," she whispered. "We've seen a lot of people fall apart on this set," he said, voice lower. "But no one's ever stood up. Not like that. And not with someone like Keanu behind them." Sydney looked down at the bottle in her hand. For the first time, she noticed it was trembling slightly. "I didn't think I had a voice," she said. "You do now," Later that afternoon, the studio released a statement. It didn't name the director. It didn't mention Keanu. It simply said filming was on pause for internal review. But people weren't stupid. They knew what it meant. Whispers became headlines. Headlines turned into pressure, and pressure became fire. By evening, the director had officially stepped away from the production for personal reasons. The crew was told they would resume filming in 3 days, under temporary leadership. But that wasn't the end. Keanu called a meeting. No cameras, no suits. Just the people who made the film real. Grips, costume designers, makeup artists, camera operators, even background actors. They all came, curious, some nervous, many hopeful. They gathered on the main soundstage. Keanu stood in front. No microphone, just his voice. "We all came here to tell a story," he began. "But somewhere along the way, we forgot that the story behind the scenes matters just as much." He looked around the room. "We can start over. We can finish this. But we do it together, with respect, with kindness, and without fear." There was silence. Then, one by one, people began to clap. Slow, unsure, then louder, real. And Sydney, standing near the edge, felt something deep within her shift. Not pride, not relief. Something stronger, ownership. But just as the meeting ended and people began to walk away, Claire approached again, her expression serious. "I found something else," she whispered to Keanu. "It's not just him. This might go deeper." Keanu frowned. "How deep?" She handed him a folder. "You'll want to sit down for this." Inside were emails, not from the director, but from a producer tied to the studio. Emails suggesting that Sydney was being set up for failure. They had wanted her to break, on purpose, to replace her, spin the story. Blame it on pressure or lack of experience. Sydney stood frozen as Keanu read, and for the first time since the incident, he looked truly angry. "We're not done," he said. The lights on set flickered as someone powered down the stage, and the truth, buried for too long, had just begun to rise. Behind the curtain, the puppeteer's night had fallen over the studio lot, but no one had gone home. Shadows stretched across empty trailers, and the wind whispered through aluminum walkways like it carried secrets too heavy for silence. Inside, the wardrobe room, where costumes still hung untouched, Keanu sat with Sydney and Claire, the folder open between them. Outside, laughter echoed faintly. Not joy, but the nervous kind. The kind that fills empty spaces when people are afraid. Of what's coming next? Keanu's fingers traced the edge of one email in the file. The sender wasn't the director. It was someone higher, someone with power. The name belonged to one of the executive producers, a man who rarely visited set, who only appeared in meetings when money was on the line. The emails weren't just suggestions. They were directives, quietly worded but unmistakable. She's not connecting with test audiences. We may need a creative shift by week 4. Lay the groundwork. If she cracks, we have replacements on standby. Sydney stared at the paper, her breath shallow. She wasn't reading a rumor. She was reading a plan. Someone had written her downfall into a schedule like it was a costume fitting. They wanted me to fail, she said quietly, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. They wanted to break me so they could replace me without a story. Keanu's jaw tightened. They underestimated you. Claire leaned in, voice low. They didn't. Just underestimate her. They counted on you not noticing. Keanu looked up sharply. Claire continued. You're a producer, remember? They didn't think you'd read between the lines. They thought you were just the face. I asked for creative freedom, Keanu replied, his voice quiet but steady. They gave me paperwork. I didn't know what they buried inside it. Now you do, Sydney said. So what do we do? The question hovered in the room like smoke. By morning, the mood on set had shifted again. The director was gone, but the new face that arrived wasn't much better. An executive from the studio, flown in overnight to oversee adjustments. He wore a designer suit and a forced smile. He shook hands with everyone and called the entire crew to a welcome meeting. Said they were moving forward together. But his eyes didn't hold truth. They held calculation. Sydney stood in the back, arms crossed. Beside her, Keanu remained still, expression unreadable. "We've decided to restructure the remaining shoot," the man said, pacing. "Tighten a few story beats, and we're introducing a consultant to assist with performance flow." The consultant stepped forward, a woman with sharp features and a clipboard so full it looked like a shield. Sydney recognized her. She had worked with her once before. She was known for one thing, replacing people quietly. Keanu raised a hand. "Who approved these changes?" he asked. The man smiled wider, like he had rehearsed the answer. "Studio leadership. We're all about teamwork here, flexibility, collaboration." Keanu nodded slowly. "That's funny, because I don't recall seeing a revised contract. And as one of the executive producers, I need to sign off on any major restructuring." The room went still. "We were under the impression," the man began. Keanu cut him off. "You were under the impression that I wouldn't push back." He turned to the crew. "They want to pretend yesterday didn't happen, but it did. And now they're trying to change the story without our consent." The consultant stepped forward. "We're here to protect the production." Keanu's voice dropped. "You're here to protect your investment, not the people." Someone in the crowd clapped, then another. Then the sound grew, like thunder starting, from the ground. The executive's smile cracked. Later that afternoon, Sydney received a call, unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "You're making this bigger than it needs to be," a voice said. Calm, male, no introduction. "Who is this?" she asked. "Someone who can make the next 5 years of your career very smooth, or very complicated." She didn't answer. "Walk away quietly," the voice continued. "We'll make it look natural. You'll get full pay. A new project. Something safe. We'll even spin it as your decision." "Or," she asked, "or, we make it look like you weren't ready. The emotional footage, the reports, nothing illegal, just enough to make people doubt." Sydney hung up without another word. She walked straight to Keanu's trailer and played him the recorded call. Claire joined them minutes later. They sat in silence for a long time, the air thick with realization. "They're not protecting the director," Keanu said finally. "They're protecting the machine, the system. So we break the machine," Claire said. Keanu shook his head. "No, we show people how it works. Let them decide if they still want to feed it." That evening, a surprise press release was issued, not by the studio, but by Keanu Reeves. It was simple, direct, and stunning. It explained the situation, the clause, the evidence, the attempt to replace a rising actress under false narratives. He didn't name names. He didn't assign blame. He simply told the truth. The release ended with one line that exploded across social media within minutes. "If protecting people is controversial, then maybe controversy is overdue." Comments flooded in. Crew members from other films shared their own experiences. Small actors posted videos in tears, saying they felt seen. Directors were silent. Some actors spoke carefully. But one thing was clear. The truth was out, and it was growing louder than anyone expected. By midnight, the executive producer who had sent the original emails was on leave. But that wasn't enough, because Sydney had made a decision. She wasn't just going to stay on this film. She was going to finish it her way, and she had just one request. "Keanu," she said, standing in the moonlit hallway outside his trailer. "Will you direct the final act with me?" He blinked, surprised. "You want me to direct?" "I want us to tell the story, not the system." Keanu paused, then smiled. Not for press, not for camera, but because he knew the answer had always been yes. Lights rise from the ashes, a week passed, and the set was no longer the same. Not in silence, not in spirit. Something deeper had taken root. Walls that once echoed with forced commands now felt alive with honest conversation. People moved, with purpose, not fear. Each step felt like part of something reborn. And at the center of it, under the quiet strength of shared vision, stood two people the industry never expected to lead together, Keanu Reeves and Sydney Sweeney. After the studio's failed restructuring, after the leaked emails, and after the press release went viral, all eyes had shifted. The film was now more than a movie. It had become a symbol, and symbols carried weight. The kind that couldn't be measured in budgets or opening weekend numbers. The kind that left a mark far beyond the screen. Sydney stood behind the monitor, watching playback from a new scene they'd just shot. Her character had just survived the death of her family, escaped capture, and now stood on the cliff edge of freedom. The rawness of her performance wasn't manufactured. It came from somewhere deep, deeper than lines or direction. It came from being broken in real life and choosing not to stay that way. Keanu stood beside her, his eyes steady, arms crossed. He didn't give notes. He didn't need to. Her silence after playback said everything. "That's the one," she whispered. "You feel it?" he asked. She nodded. He smiled. "Then we move on. No over-talking, no second-guessing, just trust." As the crew reset, Keanu stepped aside to check his phone. Messages were pouring in. Agents, journalists, even actors he hadn't spoken to in years. Most of them were congratulating him. Some were cautious. Others warned him. Hollywood had its memory, and it didn't always reward honesty. But there was one message that made him pause. From a young actor he'd worked with once, barely known. The message was short. "I watched your press release with my dad. He was fired from a set years ago for standing up for someone. He cried when you spoke. Thank you." Keanu locked his phone and took a deep breath. This was the reason. Behind the studio walls, however, the ripples were becoming waves. A quiet war had begun. The studio board, shaken by public pressure and legal exposure, had started internal reviews across all departments. Some supported what was happening. Others, older, more protective of the system, wanted it stopped. Meetings were being held in glass towers, decisions made behind closed doors. And in one of those meetings, a name came up. Claire. Someone had flagged her. An anonymous complaint claimed she had violated confidentiality by leaking internal data. Within 24 hours, Claire was suspended. Sydney found out when she arrived for a night shoot and Claire's badge no longer worked. The security guard looked uncomfortable. "Orders came down this morning?" he said. "She's been removed from set access." Sydney didn't speak. She just walked straight to Keanu's trailer. "They suspended Claire," she said, closing the door behind her. Keanu was already sitting at his small desk, reading through the shooting script. He looked up, calm but focused. "I know. They're punishing her," Sydney said, "for helping us." "They're testing us," he replied. "They want to see if we'll keep going without her." "Will we?" she asked. Keanu didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out a manila envelope from the drawer and slid it across the table. Inside were signed letters from nearly the entire crew, grips, gaffers, makeup artists, even extras, all vouching for Claire's integrity, her honesty, and her courage. "This isn't a story about one director anymore," Keanu said. "It's about what people will tolerate, and what they won't." Sydney flipped through the pages, name after name, real people, standing up when it could cost them everything. "Let's show them what that looks like," she said. The next day, without waiting for permission, Sydney stood before the crew with a camera and filmed a message. No lights, no music, no script, just truth. She told the story, not just hers, but Claire's. The silence that surrounded abuse, the people who made the industry run, but never got credit, and the cost of telling the truth. Keanu posted the video that afternoon. Within hours, it trended worldwide. Justice for Claire Jaff respect on set. Stand with Sydney actors began sharing it. Then crew members from other projects. Stories came out. The veil was slipping. The studio issued a response within 12 hours. Claire was reinstated. But something else happened too. Something no one expected. A group of independent producers, inspired by what they saw, reached out to Keanu and Sydney privately. They wanted to fund an entirely new branch of productions, artist-led, transparent, respectful. No gatekeeping, no ego-driven control, just stories told with soul. Keanu didn't say yes. Not yet. But he knew the offer mattered. So did Sydney. Filming resumed with a fire none of them had felt before. Scenes that were once mechanical now pulsed with life. The pain that had weighed on Sydney now colored her performance with raw truth. Keanu, behind the camera now more than in front, directed, not with authority but with empathy. And then came the final scene, the closing moment of the film, a scene of reconciliation, healing, and choice. The script called for her character to walk away, alone. But as the cameras rolled, Sydney changed something. She paused before leaving the frame and looked back, not as her character, but as herself. It lasted only a second, but it said everything. When the director called, "Cut," no one moved, and for the first time in weeks, there were tears not from fear or shame, but from pride. But just as the crew celebrated, wrapping cables and hugging near the monitors, Claire approached Keanu with a new message. "You should see this," she said, handing him a printed memo. His eyes scanned the page. His body tensed. Sydney stepped closer. "What is it?" she asked. Keanu looked up, eyes darker than they had been in days. "They've greenlit a documentary," he said, "about this production, without us. They're planning to control the narrative before we can finish ours." Sydney's jaw tightened. "So they still don't get it." Keanu folded the paper. "Then we'll remind them." The story they couldn't erase. The lot looked different under rain. Puddles formed in corners of the pavement, shimmering under the cold studio lights, and the canvas tents sagged slightly from the weight of the storm. People moved slower, wrapped in plastic ponchos or huddled in trailers. But inside the soundstage, under the quiet hum of heated lamps and camera cranes, something powerful stirred. Not just art, but resolve. Keanu stood near the edge of the set, arms folded, watching Sydney rehearse the final monologue. A new ending they had written together. A defiant speech that didn't exist in the original script. The film had shifted. It wasn't just about survival now. It was about truth, voice, and the cost of silence. In this scene, her character stands on the ruins of everything that once defined her, her home, her past, even her name. She stares at the horizon, bruised but unbroken. She speaks not to anyone around her but to herself, and her words are a promise. As the cameras rolled, Sydney didn't act. She lived the moment. Her voice trembled at first, then steadied, full of fire. "You tried to erase me, rewrite me, break me, but I am still here, and I am more than your story." When the final line left her lips, the set fell silent. No one called cut, because no one needed to. Keanu stepped forward, his eyes glassy, and placed a hand on her shoulder. She turned to him, not smiling, just breathing, shaking slightly, standing taller than ever. "That's a wrap," he whispered. The crew clapped slowly at first, then louder. Real applause. Not for the scene, but for the journey, for what they had just finished. Not just a film, but a revolution born in quiet rebellion. But the real fight wasn't over. 3 days later, the studio dropped the trailer for their unauthorized documentary. Dramatic cuts, staged interviews, polished narration. It painted the director as passionate, called the conflict a creative misunderstanding, and framed Sydney's breakdown as a teachable moment. Keanu watched the trailer in silence. Sydney sat across from him, jaw clenched. "They're rewriting it," she whispered. "They're burying the truth under studio polish." Keanu said nothing. He simply walked to a locked cabinet in the editing room and pulled out a drive. One he had kept safe from day one. It held behind-the-scenes footage, real interviews, uncut rehearsals. Not for profit, not for damage. Just the truth. He handed it to Sydney. "Then let's tell our story." They uploaded it quietly. No studio, no ads, no credits. Just a 47-minute documentary titled Unfinished: What Happened Behind the Camera. Within hours, it exploded. Fans, actors, directors, even people far from the film world. It was raw. Sydney's shaky confession from the day she was humiliated. Keanu's private confrontation with the director, recorded by a boom mic that had never been turned off. Claire's timeline of abuse on previous sets, but most of all, the moment when the crew, one by one, stood in front of the camera and simply said, "We believe her." The internet didn't just react. It erupted. Memes became movements. Other actors began sharing their own stories. Hashtags were replaced by actions. Contracts were reviewed. Sets restructured. And for the first time in years, the word respect became louder than the word exposure. The studio responded, of course. Official statements, new leadership, promises to do better. But it didn't matter anymore, because people had stopped waiting for permission to speak. Months passed, award season arrived, and to everyone's surprise, the film, the real film, was nominated for 6 major categories: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actress. When Sydney's name was announced, she didn't cry. She simply looked across the table at Keanu, who nodded once, as if to say, "You earned this long before they noticed." On the night of the ceremony, they sat side by side in the 3rd row. She wore no diamonds, no hired stylist, just a simple dress, elegant and strong, like the girl who had once been told she wasn't enough. When the presenter called her name for Best Actress, the room stood. But it wasn't the trophy that mattered. It was what she said on stage. She didn't thank the Academy first. She thanked the crew, the ones who stayed when it was hard, the ones who believed her when it was dangerous, the ones who showed the world what respect really looked like. And finally, she looked toward Keanu, who remained seated, quietly smiling. "Thank you," she said softly, "for standing up when the world told you to stay quiet." Outside, after the show, they stood beneath the stars, away from the noise, just the two of them. "Do you think they'll forget?" she asked. Keanu shook his head. "Truth doesn't fade. It echoes. And somewhere, down the halls of power, and backlots full of new stories, those echoes began to shape something new, not just for one actress or one set, but for everyone who had ever been told to stay small. Because they weren't small anymore. They were seen, they were heard, and they were never going back.